Hello everyone, I am the Mad Kirby, and welcome to my channel, The Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews and other deck techs. On the season finale of The Brewery, I'll be discussing my take on a commander as voted on by viewers a couple of weeks ago, Malik Grim Manipulator. This video is sponsored by Wizards of the Coast, so check out the link in my description. That would really help out the channel at no extra cost to you. To see other cool folks who support my content, check out the description below. That also helps out the channel at no extra cost. But the very best way you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. There are plenty of perks for being a patron, such as early access to certain videos, exclusive deck techs, gifts, and more for as little as $1. You could also become a channel member for just 99 cents. Show off your support with a logo next to your name and exclusive emojis. Or you can always just support my channel for free by simply liking, subscribing, and sharing, which also helps out a lot. I put out a video every Monday, so you don't want to miss out. You can join my Discord server for free if you want to join the Commander Tavern community. All pertinent links are down in the description. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Malik is a 4/3 human rogue for 2 generic, 1 red, 1 white, and 1 black. He has 2 triggered abilities. The first one happens when he enters the battlefield, playing a mini-game with an opponent. You each secretly choose a creature, and then whatever creatures are chosen get sacrificed. So if you manage to outwit your opponent, they'd end up sacrificing 2 creatures. His other triggered ability creates a treasure token whenever an opponent sacrifices a creature, which plays with his first triggered ability. However, we're not going to just rely on the first ability to make opponents sacrifice creatures. This color combination has plenty of cards that force opponents to do that. For starters, there's Liliana's Triumph, Sheoldred's Edict, Virtuous' Maneuver, Demon's Disciple, Fleshback Marauder, Merciless Executioner, and Sheoldred. These are essentially one-time use only effects, since the first 3 are sorceries and the last 4 are ATB effects. However, since the deck has a handful of reanimation effects, you could potentially reuse the ETB triggers from these creatures. Speaking of which, Sheoldred has a pretty busted ability of being able to transform into the True Scriptures. This should be fairly easy to achieve with a deck designed to kill off all opponents' creatures. Once she transforms, it destroys a creature or planeswalker per opponent. Then each opponent discards 3 and mills 3. Finally, you reanimate all creatures from all graveyards and then transform it back into Sheoldred. Absolutely busted here. Geese's favorite shovel also provides a sort of repeatable sacrifice effect since it's tied to an attack trigger. Whenever the equipped creature attacks, the defending player has to sacrifice a creature before even getting to the blocker step of the combat phase. If they only had 1 creature, the equipped creature is basically unblockable. On top of that, you get a 2/2 zombie for your troubles. But we already knew this shovel would synergize with Malik. Wink wink. Helm of the Host is another equipment that provides repeatable sacrifice effects when equipped to Malik. Since it creates a non-legendary copy of equipped creature, if it's Malik, then you get his ETB trigger again. If it were something like Sheoldred, you get the ETB trigger again. Unfortunately, transforming Sheoldred requires exiling her, so if she's a token, it won't get to transform. In any case, having multiple copies of Malik also means getting even more treasures whenever opponents sacrifice creatures. So there's that too. Hellish Rebuke, Bonus Hunger, and Make an Example are more sacrifice spells, but these have the potential of making opponents sacrifice a bunch of creatures at once. You do have to take damage with Hellish Rebuke, so it won't help you if your alpha strikes somehow. But if you want to use it to Kingmake and spite the aggressor, go for it. Archfiend of Depravity is another card that can make opponents sacrifice a large amount of creatures. Granted, they get to keep 2 of them, but this thing is the bane of token decks. I love it, even more so here. Naturally, Grave Pact, Dictate of Erebos, and Martyr's Bond are also included in the deck. There are plenty of effects in the deck where the sacrifice is symmetric, particularly the previously mentioned creatures. Thanks to these enchantments, we can hit 2 creatures per opponent with any of them. Or, if any of them were to die in combat, be killed, etc., then we also hit the table. These are too good not to be included. Martyr's Bond in particular, every time we sacrifice a treasure, opponents have to sacrifice an artifact. Speaking of symmetric effects, by invitation only, Promise of Loyalty and Single Combat hit the entire table. But if everyone is sacrificing creatures while we still have Malik, we'll get a ton of treasures even if we lose him. We'll then have enough mana to recast him anyways. Or with Single Combat and Promise of Loyalty, we can at least keep Malik. Opponents will also keep only 1 of their creatures. But if we follow those up with an effect that has the table sacrifice a creature, then we just wipe the whole board. Cataclysm, Mythos of Snapdax, and Cataclysmic Gearhawk do the same thing, but also hit other permanents besides creatures. Cataclysm is absolutely backbreaking since it also hits lands. Since we're creating a ton of treasures, this will almost always have everyone scooped since we'll be the only one realistically able to play afterwards. If we pay the appropriate colors for the Mythos, then we choose what stays. Another incredibly oppressive card. Ruinous Ultimatum and Onto Inversion don't achieve interaction via sacrifice, but they're still worth including. Especially since the ultimatum affects only opponents. It's not that hard to cast with all our treasures either. Onto Inversion doesn't even take up a slot on the deck if you play it as a land when you need the land drop. Tybalt's Trickery, Chaos Warp, Guff Rewrites History, Utter End, Generous Gift, and Stroke of Midnight are the rest of the deck's non-synergistic interaction. Sure, we're dealing with creatures in so many different ways, but creatures aren't the only card type in the game. These help deal with any single target threats, which are just as important. That being said, the last two, giving opponents creatures, is great because then they have things to sacrifice, which will give us more treasures. Besides creating treasure, there are other things we can do with a deck so heavily focused on making opponents sacrifice everything. Gives the Glorious Resurrector, Tergrid God of Fright, and It That Betrays makes these edict effects even more annoying. Gives steals the creatures no matter how or why they died, whereas the last two only do so when they're sacrificed. Tergrid also steals cards that are discarded, but we only make that happen with Shieldred Saga. But she's still going to trigger quite often here anyways. As a bonus, It That Betrays has Annihilator. Granted, it costs a whopping 12 mana to cast, but we are creating plenty of treasure after all. Debtor's Null, Shieldred Whispering One, Virtue of Presence, and Portal to Phyrexia also have the potential of stealing creatures, but they have to be in the graveyard. These can also reanimate creatures from our own graveyard if we needed to recover something, or recycle the Fleshbag Marauder type creatures in it. As a bonus, the Virtue can be sent on an adventure for an early game removal spell, and the Portal makes all opponents sacrifice 3 creatures when it enters the battlefield. Other things we can do with treasures is just win the game outright. The deck's running Reckless Fireweaver and Ingenious Artillerist to ping all opponents whenever we create those treasures, as well as Agent of the Iron Throne and Nadir's Nightblade to ping all opponents whenever we crack those treasures. Best of all is Mirkwood Bats that triggers both on creation and cracking. These cards do a ton of work and that damage adds up. Granted, once all creatures are dead, we can't really create any more treasures with Malik, so we could just swing in with them and deal damage via combat. Or we can just win outright with Revel in Witches or Hellkite Tyrant. The enchantment has a trigger similar to Malik, but it works regardless of how the creatures died. The dragon can potentially win us the game even faster, since it steals all artifacts from an opponent when it enters the battlefield. We do have to wait until our upkeep, but hopefully we can protect these win cons until then. Forbidden Orchard and Ox Drover are included in order to make sure opponents will always have a creature to sacrifice. This might seem a bit counterintuitive, since we don't want to give them sacrifice fodder. Therefore, these effects should not be used when they already have creatures. That being said, if we want a treasure for whatever reason, giving them a solitary token that will be sacrificed will help fuel the deck more so than help the opponent, especially since Ox Drover draws us a card whenever it attacks. Bonus points for equipping it with Giz's favorite shovel. Speaking of drawing us cards, Harvester of Souls and Liliana Dreadhorde General has the potential of drawing us a ton of cards. The demon triggers whenever a non-token creature dies, while Liliana doesn't care what they are so long as we control them. She also creates sacrifice fodder while also providing a reusable edict effect with her -4 loyalty ability. However, at such a steep cost, we won't be doing that each turn anytime soon. Her ultimate is another type of cataclysm effect, but only affects opponents, which is great. Academy Manufacturer can also draw us cards, but indirectly via creating clue tokens along with our treasure tokens. It also creates food tokens, which can be good in a pinch, but help us accelerate a win via Hellkite Tyrant or the other win cons that care about artifacts entering the battlefield or tokens leaving the battlefield. This card is absolutely amazing here, and it's one of my favorite Magic cards of all time. Inspiring Statuary also makes the most of all those artifact tokens being created. There's more than a handful of cards in the deck with steep costs, particularly generic costs, so being able to tap our treasure or other artifacts to pay for them help us keep those treasures too as mana rocks. Black Market Connections, Phyrexian Arena, Valakut Awakening, and the One Ring provide non-synergistic card advantage. The first one can also provide us sacrifice fodder and our chump blockers, as well as treasures if we pay enough life, which is a good thing. The manufacturer creates food too. Valakut doesn't take up a slot if we use it as a land when we need it. And by this point, unless you've been living under a rock, the One Ring needs no explanation to how amazing it is, especially in a non-blue deck like this one. While the deck doesn't require Malik to win, it's still worth it to protect him somewhat, or at the very least our win cons, so you can never go wrong with Lightning Greaves, Swiftfoot Boots, Champion's Helm, and Mithril Coat. These don't help against sacrifice effects, but they do protect against opponent's own interaction. We gotta keep that Hellkite Tyrant alive after all. Boros Charm, Teferi's Protection, and Clever Concealment are included for that non-telegraphed response. Best of all, these also protect our tokens, while the latter two protect against any kind of effect that would deal with our board. As previously mentioned, we don't have to worry too much about Malik because if we also created a bunch of treasure while he died, we can potentially recast him quite easily. That being said, treasure production isn't the deck's only mana acceleration. Wayfarer's Bauble, Navigation Orb, Burnished Heart, Sword of the Animus, Bitterthorn Nissus Animus, and Sword of Hearth and Home are also included. Land-based ramp will always be better than artifact-based ramp, and fortunately we've been getting colorless land-based ramp cards more frequently than not. Granted, Sol Ring is still in the deck, but you'd be hard-pressed to find any commander deck that won't make the most of running it, such as at least paying for Cabal Coffers, which is in the deck. The deck is practically 50% black, so this will do a lot of work, especially when paired with Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth, also in the deck. Keep in mind that unlike the MDFC lands, I do not count Cabal Coffers as a land slot because it doesn't tap for land on its own. Maybe in a mono black deck, but in here, it takes up a spell slot. Speaking of land slots, the rest of the deck is just the rest of the lands. The deck's running all 10 fetch lands, all 3 shock lands, all 3 opponent lands, Savai Triome, Reflecting Pool, Command Tower, and Ancient Tomb, along with 3 of each basic land for all the land-based ramp effects in the deck. As with all of my deck techs, you can build your mana base according to your budget. Whether you include more expensive cards or even cheaper cards is up to you. You do you. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Malik Grim Manipulator. There's definitely a potential of making this deck even more oppressive if you so choose. Likewise, you can also make it a bit less evil by taking out the insta-win effects. However, if you're consistently depriving opponents of keeping a board, you might as well leave those insta-win effects to put them out of their misery. If you're interested in the deck list of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the brewers, for their patronage. I also want to thank any channel members. Your membership is greatly appreciated. I'd also like to thank Wizards of the Coast for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to check the link in the description too, that also helps out the channel. And to those who voted on this video, thank you for your input. To everyone else, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am the Mad Kirby, happy brewing, and see you next season.